What makes someone join a cult? Is it a weakness or emotional vulnerability? A lack of family relations and support system? Are the people stupid, brainwashed, weak-minded, or too lazy to think for themselves, like how so many on the internet like to insult and belittle those they have never met? It's interesting how quickly we are to dismiss others when in all actuality it is easy for many to fall prey to them. According to studies, cult members fit relatively similar demographics across most new religious movements, with many who join them having higher levels of education, higher financial success, and fewer time constraints. After all, college is a time where people are introduced to many different situations, studies, and ways of life. This open-mindedness that comes when being presented with new information from students being confronted with new ideas from all areas of study can also lead to a vulnerability. This isn't to say that students and educated persons blindly accept all ideas, but rather they tend to take in and process ideas before rejecting them. These people make wonderful recruits for cults, especially since, over time, their financial commitments, social bonds, and standards of living become the cult. We're going to explore one of the most well-known cults today, how it operated, and how it eventually ended. Let's take a dive into the history of Heaven's Gate. Hello everyone and welcome to Wicked Encounters, where we explore just what goes bump in the night. I'm your host Allie, and today we're going to be discussing the American New Religious Movement cult, Heaven's Gate. Founded in 1974, Heaven's Gate was led by Bonnie Nettles and Marshall Applewhite. Marshall Applewhite was born on May 17, 1931 in Spur, Texas. As the son of a Presbyterian minister, he was very religious as a child, which made life difficult for him in the future. He obtained a bachelor's degree in philosophy at Austin College, served in the United States Army, and later enrolled at Union Presbyterian Seminary to study theology in hopes of becoming a minister. He was married to Ann Pierce at this time, and the couple had 2 children. Life seemed good for Applewhite. Though early in his studies, he decided to leave the school to pursue a career in music, where he enrolled at the University of Colorado and earned a master's degree in music with a focus on musical theater. After which, he moved the family to New York City to become a professional singer, which, it's the Big Apple. Most people's dreams are dashed on the rocks here, and Applewhite was no different. So he did what most people do after that failure. He became a college professor. He taught at the University of Alabama until losing his position after a scandal. You see, Marshall Applewhite was gay. He'd been fired after pursuing a sexual relationship with a male student in Alabama, which is in the South, in the 1960s. Also, there is a very clear power imbalance between a professor and a student, so it was just an all-around very bad situation. Plus, he was married, though not for long after Anne learned of the affair in 1965 and divorced Applewhite 3 years later. He then revealed to his parents that he was homosexual, and his father rejected him. Life went from pretty good to sucking for Applewhite. After his time at the University of Alabama, he moved to Houston, where he served as chair of the music department at the University of St. Thomas, where he also was the chorus director of the Episcopal Church and performed with the Houston Grand Opera. After 5 years, though, he resigned from the university, citing depression and other emotional problems, though some speculate that his departure was actually caused by another potential affair between Applewhite and a student, and the president of the university later recalled that he was often disorganized near the end of his tenure. With a deep depression, the death of his father, and mounting debt, things weren't going well for Marshall Applewhite. And then came Bonnie Nettles. Bonnie Nettles was born on August 29, 1927 in Houston, Texas. Born into a Baptist family, she wasn't very content with the religion and began to move away from it as an adult. She became a registered nurse and married Joseph Nettles in 1949, with whom she had 4 children. Things were mostly stable in Nettles' marriage, though in 1972 she began studying astrology, theosophy, and the occult with regular attempts at trying to contact the dead by conducting seances, and began to believe she was in frequent contact with a 19th century monk named Brother Francis. She would also regularly visit various fortune tellers, who supposedly told her that she would meet a tall man of fair complexion with light hair. If you're realizing that Bonnie's little backstory is a lot shorter than Marshall's, it's because, well, it is. Very little is known about Nettles' life growing up. All that's really known is that she was born and raised in Houston, liked reading up on the occult and UFOs, wrote the astrology column in her local newspaper, and was married with 4 kids after becoming a registered nurse. But with all that said, despite knowing so little of Bonnie, she was definitely the brains behind the cult and its beliefs, especially once her mysterious meeting with a fair-complexioned, light-haired man came true, with Marshall Applewhite. The two first met in 1972 under conflicting circumstances. It's either because Marshall had a heart attack and Bonnie was his nurse, or from Marshall visiting the hospital to see a sick friend. Either way, the two did meet in a hospital that Bonnie worked at, and continued their conversations with Applewhite feeling he had known Nettles in a past life, and Nettles telling him their meeting was foretold to her by extraterrestrials.
Cocaine's a hell of a drug.
Which is a funny way of saying fortune tellers. It's not exactly a typical conversation you'd expect to have with a nurse in a hospital, unless it's maybe a psychiatric ward, but this conversation led to the two forming a friendship where they would ponder the Bible and its teaching, study passages from the New Testament, and read science fiction, leading to the two reaching the conclusion that they had been chosen to fulfill biblical prophecies, and that they had been given higher-level minds than other people. Quite the conclusion to come to, but once again, they bonded over the belief they met in another lifetime and prophetic meetings. Marshall soon moved in with Bonnie, which helped push her husband to divorce her and her losing custody of their 4 children. Marshall and Bonnie's relationship wasn't a sexual one, despite this cohabitation, and when Nettles lost contact with her family, Applewhite cut contact with his as well. Without anyone to anchor them down from their belief system, they concluded that they were the 2 witnesses described in the Book of Revelation. For some background knowledge, the 2 witnesses are prophets with the power to shut down the heavens and turn water into blood that are said to appear in the times of the Antichrist before and during the second coming of Christ. Applewhite and Nettles also began writing pamphlets, one of which said that Jesus had been reincarnated as a Texan, and who also just happened to coincidentally basically describe Applewhite. They came to this conclusion as their conversations went, that Bonnie had the ideas and knowledge and Marshall had the charisma. Bonnie would become the brains, and Marshall the mouthpiece for their cult. The two opened a bookstore known as the Christian Arts Center that carried books from various spiritual backgrounds as well as a venture known as No Place, KNOW, where they taught classes on theosophy, New Age beliefs, and mysticism, though neither business venture lasted long, with the two deciding to travel about to teach others about their beliefs throughout the western United States with little money and would often need to sell their blood or work odd jobs for funding on their journey. They began venturing to different churches to discuss their beliefs, where they began referring to each other as the Two or the UFO Two, and claimed that when they died, they would be resurrected and transported onto a spaceship in an event they referred to as the demonstration. Surprisingly, other religious groups didn't react positively to their claims, and they were often told to leave. This didn't deter the two as they continued preaching their beliefs, utilizing more and more extraterrestrial elements. They taught that God was an extraterrestrial being, that a UFO would take them to heaven, as it was very much a physical place that could be traveled to during the upcoming apocalypse, and that through biology and chemical processes, they would be transformed into extraterrestrial beings, as well as taking the next evolutionary level above humans along with their followers. They turned the Bible into a sci-fi novel, and booked conference rooms to host talks with titles like UFO and the Kingdom, to continue bringing science fiction and religion together. And then suddenly, they started to get a following. Well, one follower at least, Sharon Morgan, who knew the two previously and left her family for about a month before returning. After she came back, her husband charged Bonnie and Marshall with credit fraud, though the charges were quickly dropped when Morgan said that she allowed them to use her card. This did bring to police attention the fact that Applewhite failed to return a car he rented in Missouri, which he was promptly arrested for and sat in jail for 6 months. During this time, he made a startling revelation that he and Nettles weren't going to become aliens, but that they were aliens already, and so was Jesus Christ, since he was the Son of God. From this realization, they solidified the basic structure of Heaven's Gate, and soon the unthinkable happened. They began to gather actual followers. It was a slow process that took conversation after conversation with individual people, but as mentioned before, Bonnie had the ideas and Marshall had the charisma. He had taken classes to become a minister and grew up with a minister father. He sang and performed music growing up, and with that came an exceptional ability to speak and perform in front of others. That, combined with the solidification of their beliefs, he was convincing enough to have others join them. And with that came a name change for Bonnie and Marshall: Bo and Peep. These names were chosen as they viewed themselves as the shepherds of humanity. In 1975, they were invited to speak at a metaphysical meetup hosted by Clarence Klug, who held similar-ish beliefs to Nettles and Applewhite, but where they used aliens and UFOs, he used chakras and tantric energy. Basically yoga, which is also a cult. Klug was a wannabe cult leader, whose group was in complete disarray with gossip, drama, and a leader who clearly wanted too much from his members too quickly. When his followers saw Bo and Peep, they saw charisma, eyes full of understanding, peace, and love. So after a 2-night seminar, 24 people left Klug and joined Heaven's Gate. People joined Heaven's Gate easily. Well, at the time it was known as human individual metamorphosis, but they left just as easily, with Applewhite and Nettles being some of the few leaders to allow their followers to leave with no strings attached. There were even some instances where Applewhite would actually pay for the now ex-followers' bus ticket so they could return to their family, which many did. A lot of people left their family, and specifically their children, as the group had a very clear rule that it was adults only, and no one under 18 was allowed to join. As their follower count grew, Bonnie and Marshall decided on another name change, this time for good, as the two began to go by T and Do, potentially due to their love of music. T and Do, along with their followers, were still nomadic at this point. They didn't have a set compound yet, so very often they would lose their followers simply because they didn't know where to go. It was tough being a member because you very often simply got lost on where the next meeting was or where T and Do were setting up their next campsite. There were rules the followers had to follow, such as selling all worldly possessions, abstaining from sex, drugs, and alcohol, as well as finally cutting off communication from family and friends. For a cult that was so loosely joined as T and Do's, though, this caused a lot of issues, especially since the main reason for why people joined, the leaders, were so hard to keep track of. This came to a head when in 1976, T and Do were giving a presentation. They had already lost half of their followers, and the other half was beginning to question if they had made the right decision leaving their families. When suddenly, during the heckling, Nettles stood up and announced that only 100 people would be able to join her and Applewhite on the spaceship to heaven. The rest would be left behind for the apocalypse. Soon after, the group would seemingly disappear along with a select group of followers. Then the rules really cracked down. During the time of the cult's disappearance, they would be readying themselves for the next level. After all, the whole purpose of the cult was to make its members ready to reach the next step of evolution. Those who were members were to no longer think of the demonstration or ascension. They were to focus only on the present, their personal growth, and pleasing their leaders, which helped enforce the beliefs of the cult. T and Do began living in a camper that was referred to as Central, while various small groups of followers were referred to as star clusters, all together in Wyoming. They also doubled down on their followers forgoing family bonds, cigarettes, relationships, and especially sex. No sex, ever, or masturbating. You touch your bits and you're filthy and unworthy of going to heaven. Members would even take shifts to keep an eye on others to make sure such things weren't happening. Why? Because those who weren't in the cult were now referred to as Luciferians, and only Luciferians needed to procreate or worry about carnal pleasures and earthly delights. Those that were going to the next level had no need for them, and anyone who could be tempted to stay on Earth was basically going to stay in hell rather than get that sweet ride to heaven and live forever as an alien. Though something interesting happened with that. You see, Bonnie and Marshall were supposed to be aliens in human bodies, and they had gone so far as to call themselves the reincarnation of God the Father and Jesus Christ. So there was a bit of a hiccup when T, Bonnie, was diagnosed with cancer. In 1983, Bonnie Nettles had to have an eye removed due to cancer, and was informed by her doctor that the disease had already spread throughout the rest of her body. Of course, she, Applewhite, and their followers didn't believe the doctor. She, after all, was destined to ascend together with Applewhite on the UFO to heaven. Yet still, the cancer continued to devour her body, eventually moving to her liver and causing her death on June 19, 1985, at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, Texas. Applewhite had a dilemma. With the death of Nettles, they wouldn't be able to ascend together. He was a beau without his peep, a doe without his tea, and this caused confusion and chaos amidst the group until Applewhite had an idea. Applewhite said that Nettles' broke-down vehicle, her body, was left behind, and that she had gone on to the next level without him, as her work here was done on this level, but that he still had more to do, and with the guidance of Bonnie, he would continue to lead the cult. This marked a turning point, as suddenly the theology went from the belief that they would physically ascend to heaven while alive aboard a UFO, changed to that the body was simply a vehicle for the soul, a vehicle that would be discarded upon entering heaven. Suddenly, the body was no longer of much value, and Applewhite made sure to describe it in such ways, and also changed the name of the group to Total Overcomers Anonymous. In 1995, the cult started a business called Higher Source Contract Services, which provided computer programming, graphic design, and web design services. The internet was a new way for Applewhite to get the cult's teachings out there, and posted them on their website, though he mostly received criticism. This was when Applewhite decided to begin discussing mass suicide.
Planet Earth about to be recycled.
As a way for him and his followers to leave their vehicles behind, and the group officially took on the name of Heaven's Gate. They purchased 40 acres of land in rural New Mexico and built a compound that they referred to as the Earth Ship, using tires and lumber, that would be used as a launch pad for their ascension. This wasn't a very practical plan, and after a particularly cold winter, they returned to living in a few houses in the San Diego area. This was also the year that Applewhite decided to castrate himself. Contrary to popular belief, not every member of Heaven's Gate was castrated. The group was increasingly focused on suppressing their sexual desires, and that resulted in Applewhite and 7 other men opting for surgical castration. The belief behind it was that sexual desire was one of the most powerful forces that kept one bound to their human bodies and hindered their ability to evolve. Applewhite taught that next-level beings had no reproductive organs and were effectively genderless and sexless. To this end, he also had members wear similar clothing and adopt similar haircuts. They had a hard time finding a surgeon willing to perform the castration surgery, but eventually they found one in where else but Mexico. Though Applewhite's was apparently a wee bit botched and he lived in pain for the rest of his life, the entire year that was. You see, Applewhite had suicide on the table for a while, saying he was only waiting for a sign to act, and eventually, that sign came in the form of the hale-bopp comet. The hale-bopp comet was discovered by Alan Hale and Thomas Bopp separately on July 23, 1995, just before it became visible to the naked eye. After its discovery, and once it was actually seen, it remained visible to the naked eye for a record 18 months, which was twice as long as the previous record holder, the Great Comet of 1811. And many believe that the cult's suicide was in order to hitch a ride onto the comet, but in all actuality, Applewhite only saw it as a sign that it was time to get going. In October 1996, the group rented a large house, which they called the Monastery, in Rancho Santa Fe, California. They also got alien abduction insurance. Yes, really, which covered abductions, impregnations, and death associated by aliens. It would cover up to 50 members, which was perfect for Applewhite and his 38 members, with a $1 million payout per person. In late March 1997, the group recorded a farewell as their final message.
And couldn't be happier about what we're about to do.
With Applewhite recording a video with the following: "We do, in all honesty, hate this world." The group went out for one last lunch together at Mary Callender's on March 22nd, where they all had identical meals of iced tea, chicken pot pie, and cheesecake. Back at the monastery, they had one last communal meal of pizza, and then the first wave of suicides began. Dressed in matching Nike Decades and black outfits made of black shirts and sweatpants, with armband patches that read Heaven's Gate Away Team, as well as a $5 bill and 3/4 in their pockets, the members went in 3 waves, with the next wave helping the last as they ate either pudding or applesauce mixed with barbiturates and alcohol, before placing a bag over their head to asphyxiate. Upon the death of the first and second wave, the bags would be removed from their heads, the bodies cleaned up, and a purple shroud placed over them, as purple was Bonnie's favorite color. Applewhite died in the master bedroom after assistance from the final 2 members. They cleaned up his body and then killed themselves, the only 2 to have bags over their faces and no purple cloth covering their top halves when the group was found. When news broke of the mass suicide, Dr. Alan Hale, the co-discoverer of the comet, held a press conference where he said that suicide caused as a result of comets are not surprising, a sad statement despite its truth. After the cult's remains were discovered with 39 bodies, 3 former members followed in suit in the following months, along with one man who left a note dated March 27th saying, "I'm going on the spaceship with hale-bopp to be with those who have gone before me." Surprisingly, that's not the end of Heaven's Gate. Its website still remains running to this day by 2 members who answer emails and keep the site exactly as it was in 1997 per Applewhite's instructions. To this day, his influence remains. Crazy, huh? And even with cults like Heaven's Gate as examples, there are plenty that are still active and recruiting today, more than you might think. But what do you think of it all? Do you think if Bonnie Nettles didn't die, that the cult would have ended in such a way? Do you want me to cover any other cults? Let me know in the comments. I read them all for future video ideas and to see how many other people enjoy learning about stuff like this, like myself. If you want to see what I release in the future, consider subscribing, liking this video, clicking the bell, and maybe sharing it with others. Many of my videos are thanks to suggestions given to me, so feel free to let me know what you'd like to see covered next time. With that, I'm Allie, this is Wicked Encounters, and I'll see you next time. Bye!